Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. I'm here to ask and answer one simple question. WTF is Wolfenstein 2, the new Colossus. We're a little late on this one. Apologies for that. I did end up finishing the whole thing, which is unusual. Usually this is first impressions, but I went through the whole thing, and I have to admit that I slogged through quite a lot of it. Reason I did that is because Wolfenstein: The New Order was my top game of that year. And I enjoyed it a hell of a lot, so needless to say, I was pretty excited about the sequel. Unfortunately, this may very well have turned out to be the biggest disappointment I've had in 2017. I'd like to tell you why that is. Try and avoid spoilers as best we can. I have finished it, and I'll be doing side missions to demonstrate what's going on, so you shouldn't get too much in the way of spoilers. It won't be showing any cutscenes or anything like that, so we can avoid that. First things first, let's jump into the options menu and see what's going on with that. First, the controls, rebindable keys, nothing particularly unusual here. Although, the one thing to bear in mind is that despite the fact that you can rebind pretty much everything, the new dual-wield system, which allows you to mix and match weapons, does make the whole thing a little bit awkward. You have the option between using numbers, rolling your mouse wheel, using a weapon wheel, but the problem with combining two different weapons together and switching between dual-wield and non-dual-wield and getting the right combination is that it requires a few key presses in order to do it. The best way to do it is usually to hold down the B button to enable left-hand cycling, then unequip that weapon. If you try to just, say you were dual-wielding assault rifles, and you try to switch to just the laser Kraftwerk, well, what's going to happen is it's actually just going to grab that in the right hand instead of going to just the single weapon in and of itself. It ends up being a little bit awkward, particularly if you want to then dual wield whatever weapon you just switched to. You hit the button again, and what it'll do is actually just go back to the single weapon, and then you have to hit it again to bring the second version of that weapon up, unless you use this hold B combination. It's just generally quite awkward to deal with. There doesn't seem to be a solution anywhere in the key binding, so bit of a problem there. Outside of that, nothing out of the ordinary. Audio sliders, pretty basic, although it does have a couple of different audio profiles available. Basically 3 of them, depending on what kind of audio setup you've got there. Master volume, music volume, voice volume. There is a general lack of just sound effects volume here, which is odd. I'm not really sure why that is. You could manipulate the music volume and the voice volume down so that the master volume would technically just raise that above the rest, but it's not a particularly great system. Usually you have a separate slider for that. That's missing for some reason. Under video options, well, you're going to have a smorgasbord of things here because this is the id Tech 6 engine, and that's got a lot of damn options in it. The issue that I had here, which is probably quite specific to my setup, is that getting G-Sync to work properly required a bit of fiddling. I had to turn off vertical sync, as you generally do, to enable G-Sync, but then I also had to go to the NVIDIA control panel and force a setting in order to get G-Sync to work, because prior to that, I was still getting tearing on the screen, which is a bit weird. Not sure why that is. It might be something, if you have G-Sync, you want to look into. I know that's the minority of people, but bear that in mind. Under advanced settings, you have a lot of options. You'll notice the max FPS actually goes above 60 this time, because it is on a different engine to the last game, so that's always nice, since that was capped at 60. And a ton of options here, including, of course, the ability to bring up fairly detailed performance statistics if you want, and turn film grain on or off. I'm actually going to reduce that because film grain generally messes with video encoding, so we'll knock that off for the time being. But plenty of choice here. Nothing to complain about on a technical level by any stretch. It is a good engine, and it runs very, very well, far as I can tell. Although, I must say, I have had quite a few crashes. In fact, I actually had a part of the game in which I was unable to progress at all because every time I tried to exit the level, it hard crashed. That was resolved. I'm not exactly sure what I did to resolve it. Honestly, it may have just been a patch, but they've gone through a couple of different iterations that have caused some problems for people, so do bear that in mind. I have had the game crash throughout my campaign about 7 times, and that's not counting the times in which it was hard locking as I attempted to exit the level. So I wasn't too pleased about that, though it did seem to even out about halfway through the game, and I hadn't had it happen since. All right. So we're going to jump into after the end of the game, whereby they just let you run around the home base and also complete any of the so-called Enigma missions, which are the side missions, and that's exactly what we're going to be doing here. So we'll jump right into that. If you want 100% completion, you're going to have to do this. This side mission system is simply really for going back to previous levels. They're all the exact same levels that you've been in before, and the goal is the same every mission, which is to kill an Uber commander who you would think would be challenging, but actually just dies in one hit, which is a bit of a disappointment. I was hoping for some varied bosses, some different themes, nothing of the sort to distinguish or differentiate any of them. And the objective on each side mission is always the same. Welcome to your home base. I won't talk too much about it because of the obvious spoilers going on there, and this is the kill board, which is all of the commanders that you have to deal with. Now, the way that you go there is by using the map. I'm going to, again, try and avoid the major spoiler here by not showing one of the locations. In order to get access to these, you have to collect these Enigma codes, which drop from commanders. For some inexplicable reason, you have to pick them up manually. They don't pick up as you run over them, so you can occasionally miss them, which is pretty irritating. And in order to unlock these commanders, you have to do a little minigame to decipher the whole thing. This is entirely pointless and a complete waste of time. I don't know why they bothered with this, since you have to do it every single time. I got no explanation for it. It's not fun. It's just a time waster, and you can actually lose Enigma codes if you're too slow here. So, that's not usually a problem. But, yeah, don't mess it up. Otherwise, you might have to go and collect more damn Enigma codes, which means usually running missions again in order to get them. Especially if you haven't been killing too many commanders and you've just been sneaking past them. Alright, we have unlocked a Uber commander that's hanging around in Manhattan. We'll go and take them out. Now, the first game was a pretty fantastic globe-trotting adventure, frankly. Phenomenal. Massive variety in locations. Massive variety in scenery. This game, no. I don't really know what happened. I mean, the focus obviously is on the United States this time around, but that's no real excuse to not have a great variety of levels and locations and color palettes and all sorts of things like that. First game had plenty of that. It was always keeping you guessing. It was always surprising as to where you were going, and it kept escalating it, and it was phenomenal. I was always looking forward to learning where I'd be going next. In this game, no. You have 3 or 4 main regions that are split up into districts, and a lot of them are very similar. This is the worst set of levels in the game by far. Everything in Manhattan, oh lord, it could not get any dollar as far as I'm concerned. In Manhattan is one of the worst FPS levels I've actually ever played. Why is that? What's my explanation for that particular opinion? Well, it's simply down to the fact that it is full of invisible walls, the terrain is simply brown, with no visible landmarks whatsoever, and it is astonishingly dull and difficult to navigate, frequently turning you on yourself, and with that lack of distinguishable landmarks and everything looking exactly the same, it is extremely hard to navigate. I'm certainly not the only person to have complained about this particular level, and honestly, that's been a pretty common theme throughout Wolfenstein 2. There's something about the level design this time around that is much more difficult to navigate than the New Order was. I'm frequently finding myself getting turned around. The map system is, frankly, insufficient for most levels. Stuff like this, you know, this is easy enough. This is just a little penthouse level. Just shooting enemies, nothing to really worry about here. Nothing particularly difficult. But the level leading up to this, which is finding this penthouse, good lord, it was astonishingly frustrating. It drove me up the damn wall. And I would say a good third of the levels did that in terms of navigation. turning you around so frequently. And while there is a navigation hint system, it's not particularly good. And the reason I say this is because it's extremely small and doesn't show up on the screen all the time. It only shows up on the screen if you happen to be facing the right direction. You can see right here, that tiny little white arrow is what I'm talking about right there. Can't see a thing. There we go. Let's head down here and find this guy and take him out. If we can. I'll switch over to a different weapon to show you what's going on here. It drove me mad. And in Wolfenstein in particular, the navigation issue is fairly severe. The reason for that is you may remember from the first game that the way the health system works is based on so-called overcharge. And that means that once you go over a certain amount of health, your health will degrade over time. As you can see on the screen right here, I actually have a bunch of perks to make it degrade a lot slower. It degrades much faster than this at the start. But the issue with difficult to navigate levels is if you happen to overcharge. That was that level, by the way. That was a pretty quick side mission. If you happen to overcharge and then get lost, by the time you find the next pack of enemies, you've lost all of that extra health that you grabbed. Armor is permanent, but health, not so much. And for a particular story reason that I don't want to spoil, the game starts you with very little maximum health, and that basically sticks around for about half the game. And the game has crashed. Lovely. Well, unfortunately, it seems as if Manhattan is the reason for a lot of the crashes. So I had to jump out of that mission and go back to a previous save, because every time I exited that mission, it was hard crashing. So, just watch out for that one, it seems. We'll jump into Roswall instead, and continue the points that I was making. So I was talking about the navigation, I was talking about the general level design, and how bland it is this time around, and how unmemorable most of the actual levels and missions are. There's only a couple from this particular version of the game that I found to be memorable, as opposed to the New Order, where that applies to almost every level in the game. Too many streets, too many urban locations, too many ruined urban locations. Not enough variety in color palette, locale, or indeed areas of the world. Which would be fine if the levels were particularly well designed in the first place, but they're not. Most of them don't have a huge variety of ways to go. Most of them funnel you in exactly the same direction. They're simultaneously linear yet confusing, which is strange. Now, there's generally only one path to go down, but plenty of dead ends and annoying little corridor areas that don't really take you anywhere. I'm not impressed, honestly. I wish I were. It's certainly not down to lack of wanting to enjoy the game, but that's a real sticking point for me. Now, let's talk about the fighting. Let's talk about the gunplay. Not really a lot to complain about, honestly. As you would expect, it's not as if the gunplay was going to get markedly worse in any way. It didn't. But it didn't really improve all that much either. I've got to say, I don't really see the point of the whole mixed dual-wield system. I don't find it particularly useful. I barely used it throughout the game. There was very few situations in which I thought, oh god, it would be great if I had a rifle in one hand and a shotgun in the other. It's not. You know, in particular, you lose a lot of accuracy from the rifle in the first place, so you sort of lose the whole point of holding a fairly accurate medium to long-range weapon alongside a close-range weapon. And of course, you can't use the special functions of whatever weapon, such as zooming, obviously, and things like that. So, generally, I did the same thing that I did in the first game, which was dual-wield one particular weapon type, and that was pretty much it. Because, obviously, it just doubles your firepower up. It's simply a sort of unnecessary system, really, that doesn't really seem to add much to the game. It was cool that they added it, but they couldn't seem to figure out how to make it useful. Now, in terms of weapon variety, got about as much as the first game had, which is a disappointment. And why is that? Well, I mean, we're talking about the big sequel here. We're talking about the big follow-up to a very successful and, frankly, extremely good game. Which means you are expecting everything to be bigger, everything to be better. There to be more variety, more exotic weapons available. And, well, it's just not the case. You have a fairly standard loadout of weapons that do exactly what you would expect, and the only standard weapon that is a little bit unusual, well, you had it in the first game, and that's the laser Kraftwerk. Everything else, it's, well, pistol, SMG, shotgun. You get just the automatic shotgun this time around. You don't even end up with the semi-automatic or the pump before you get that. And then your rifle. And there's a little grenade launcher that you get. Outside of that, there's a couple of little temporary heavy weapons that you can grab, of course. But I was hoping for a lot more. I was hoping for something a little bit unusual. I was hoping to see a marked advancement, I suppose, in technology and variety, and it simply didn't happen. Now, there are a couple of different combat techniques that you can get. For instance, right now, I happen to have an upgrade, which lets me, well, ram into people. If I do it right. There we go. You got your melee takedown system, as you would expect, and the ability to throw hatchets as opposed to knives this time around. But the combat is, for all intents and purposes, exactly the same. Which is fine. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Sure. But again, big sequel. You expect to see some marked flagship new features. Of which I think the biggest one is probably this. You can get an upgrade that lets you squeeze down here. And you might think, well, that gives you all sorts of ways to approach problems and find all sorts of secrets and things like that in the level. Well, not really, no. I didn't find that particular upgrade to be all that useful. I found it to be a little confusing, more so than anything else. I hate getting over this counter. This happened the last time as well. For some reason, BJ is terrible at jumping over counters. Don't really know why, so you might just want to go that way. There is, like, one area where you can leap over it, but you'd expect to smoother slide over it. Does that happen? Well, no. Most of the time, there are several almost identical ways to get to the same place. And you can understand why that is. You know, it's the same as Deus Ex Human Revolution. Obviously, people have to be able to get to their destination. It's like, well, you could crawl through the vents, or you could use this upgrade or that upgrade. If that's all there is, then of course it doesn't really matter which upgrade you go for. And I didn't really find the Constrictor upgrade to be too useful in combat. You can use it for stealth in certain situations where you're able to maybe crawl under a vehicle, but those are few and far between, and ultimately I didn't really get a lot of use out of it. Also, where's the damn death card? I think I've actually done this level before, so it's not going to let me do anything, so we'll exit the district and return to the Eva's Hammer and try and show you a different mission there. Now, let's talk a little bit about stealth, because there's something I found rather curious about this game, and that's that it's a hell of a lot more difficult than the first one, to the point where normal difficulty was actually too much for me. And I wouldn't think that would be the case in a single-player shooter. I've played it and beaten a lot of them. But it's actually a fairly common complaint, surprisingly enough. The amount of damage that you take is extreme, and you're taking it from a lot of different places, to the point where I found the game more enjoyable when I turned the difficulty down. There are 7 difficulty settings. I think I'm on the second one of 7, and that's what I beat the game on, after starting at 4 and then going down to 3 and then going down to 2 about halfway through the game, because I was just simply frustrated about how quickly I was dying in some situations. I can't come up with any other reason other than damage output is extremely high. It's really about as simple as that. I don't see any other way to describe it. There's a lot of stuff coming at you, and there aren't all that many ways to avoid it other than playing a fairly cautious style, using a lot of cover, and using a fair amount of stealth. As soon as you trigger an alarm, the number of enemies that come at you from multiple directions, it's unrelenting. So it's difficult to keep up with the amount of damage that's coming in your direction. So, you know what? I turned it down, and I found the game to be a bit more enjoyable at that point. There are certainly difficulty spike sequences which were far more difficult than I would have expected to get through. But I slogged through the game eventually. I'm not really giving this much of a chance at the moment, am I? Well, yeah. And there's a pretty damn good reason for that. It's nowhere near as good as the first one. And one of the greatest things about the first one is that, yes, it was an action-packed adventure, and it was full of pretty damn pulpy scenarios. Ridiculous pulpy scenarios. But, regardless of that, the characters remained grounded and interesting. And you were frequently engaging with those characters. And, well, the main character was the least interesting. That is absolutely true this time as well. Without question, as far as I'm concerned. The problem is this time around, they've gone way heavier into the cutscenes. When I checked YouTube for some supercuts, it seemed anywhere between 60 and 90 minutes more cutscenes than the first game. And they're noticeably lengthier as well. Some of them drag on for a hell of a long time. The early game has quite a few of them, as well as some QT-heavy flashbacks, which felt completely out of place. And the first half of the game is very little interaction with all of the interesting characters, as in the characters that you gather from the first game and those that you meet in the second, and a lot of BJ just monologuing to himself. Which I am afraid is actually not that entertaining. BJ is not a very interesting character, and they didn't do a great job of making him interesting in this version of the game either. They had an opportunity to flesh him out in a great way, but they didn't. The early flashback sequences were an effort to do that. But the thing is, we knew all of this already from the first game. And while we get to see a little bit more of it and actually like kind of participate in it, that didn't help flesh the character out. I knew that this was the guy and why he was the way that he was from the first game. So you didn't need to show me that. Maybe it was an effort to inform people and quickly get people on board with the character who hadn't played the first game. But for me, as someone that had, that was not in any way useful to me, and I found it to be a waste of time. Like I say, the first half of the game, BJ is an extremely dull and frankly depressing character. Whereas quite a few of the other people are colorful, entertaining, and interesting, which contrasts pretty damn sharply with the way that BJ is acting. And not in a good way. Now, in the second half of the game, he cheers up for a particular reason. I'm not gonna tell you what, because it's an obvious spoiler, but it really soured me to BJ as a character in general. I was just hoping there would be more involvement of the other characters, especially in the gameplay. There isn't. Hell, I was hoping to get to play as another character. You don't get to do that, which is a missed opportunity as far as I'm concerned. That means that most of your interaction with these characters is going to be done through some of the optional exploration of your home base. You'll get a little bit out of them there, but most of it, the majority of it, comes from cutscenes. Cutscenes, 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 and god damn it, are there so many bloody cutscenes. And if they weren't so well written, I would have skipped a lot of them. They are well written, because these characters are well acted and very interesting, with the exception of the main character. But holy hell, did they overdo it on the length. They outstay their welcome as far as I'm concerned in a pretty damn huge way. And they're frequently ruining the pace and flow of the game in general. Go away. They upped the number of unpleasant enemies this time around in this one. By the way, this is on difficulty level 2 of 7, just bear that in mind. I think there were opportunities to get those characters involved, and again, in a game, it's about playing, not showing. You know, there's a good old phrase, show, don't tell. And in a game, it's play, don't show. And they went for show, 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 to the point of extreme tedium. Outside of that, the dialogue's great. It's really, really good. I had hoped for maybe a little bit more of a focus on what Nazi Americana, I guess, you know, that'd be a good way to describe the combination of things, really was. But there's surprisingly little of that, outside of the sequence that a lot of you saw in the trailer. that's pretty much about it. I'd like to have seen quite a bit more of that, being able to interact with quite a bit more of that. But you don't really get all that many opportunities to do it, unfortunately. You're mostly just stuck in these bombed out, uninteresting areas, unable to really interact with the daily running of Nazi America, which would have been far more interesting to see, I think. Please stop. There we go. Thank you. There's a couple of other minor complaints I've got about gameplay. One of which is the pickup radius. It's really, really small. To the point where picking up stray armor, which, by the way, is bloody well essential, more so than it even was in the first game. It's the only way you're going to survive. Is a bit of a pain. You can smash the E button to do it, but you basically have to be right on top of something in order to pick it up. I mean, in the case of that ammo, unless I'm standing on top of it, which would require me to jump on top of the box rather than be right next to it, I'm not going to get it at all. And you even noticed right there as I walked over that Sturmgewehr, I didn't pick it up until I was right on top of it. And yeah, that's actually pretty damn annoying, and it can get you killed as well, because the armor's going to be essential. Picking up health in the middle of combat requires you to hit E. And I can see why they did that, because they have this health overcharge system. So you don't necessarily want your health to be constantly being picked up all the time, because maybe you don't want to overcharge at this particular time. Maybe you want to leave that 100 health pickup for later or for after a particular encounter. I get that, but it would have still been nice, one, to have a much larger pickup radius for armor and ammo, so you're not constantly missing it and having to scrat around and hammer the E button to gather it all. Or a kind of vacuum system of some sort would be nice. But secondly, just to give players the option of allowing the game to automatically pick up health for you. Maybe they just want that. Maybe they're willing to give up that player choice and freedom as to when you use health in order to, for just convenience sake, you know, for quality of life. I'd have been entirely fine with that, frankly. It's a minor complaint, but it's an annoyance on top of a lot of other annoyances that are more severe, specifically the level design and the navigation in particular. Now, gameplay-wise, you could say that Wolfenstein 2 has more than the original because it has all of these side missions. And yeah, for completionists or people that just want to shoot more Nazis, yeah, that's there. And they also have combat simulator mode, which is quite similar to Doom's arcade mode, which is pretty damn enjoyable to play. No doubt, although you can't really run through it anywhere near as quickly as you can with Doom's system by any stretch of the imagination, because as I mentioned, you die a hell of a lot faster than you do in Doom. Speaking of dying fast, by the way, those Uber commanders aren't messing around. Even with a lot of health and armor, they can two-shot you. So that's a really great way to end a side mission. And speaking of which, I just had another sort of annoyance on top of that. The number of autosave points that this game has is irritatingly small. Trust me, you want to be hitting F5 a lot, because if you don't, you can find yourself going 5 minutes back, or in the case of side missions, back to the start of the entire level. If you get all the way through to the end and then he bloody one-shots you with his rocket pistol, on difficulty 2, I might add. You know, I'm not on high difficulty here. That's bloody well irritating. It's like, well, that was a damn waste of time, wasn't it? Yes. Yes, it was. Horrendously so. So, hit F5 on a very, very regular basis. Trust me on this. Your health can go down like a rock. All of these complaints add up to take down what could have been a very interesting game. What is a well-written game is bogged down in lengthy cutscenes, a lot of which could have been done in-game. An awful lot of it. So it means you're sitting there for 5+ minutes at a time sometimes, just watching everything go through. You're not really meeting all that many new characters along the way, and you're certainly not getting a great chance to interact with them through the gameplay. Once they're in their home base, they're not really going to be much of a factor. And in terms of the overall story, I think that it just fizzles out about halfway through, really. And I can't really tell you why that is, because it would be a spoiler. But that's my honest opinion of it. It just sort of grinds to a screeching halt, and then you're just going through the motions for the rest of it. And shooting Nazis is still fun. The soundtrack is still great. The gunplay still feels fantastic. Dual wielding is as enjoyable as it was. Wish it was with more interesting weapons and with more meaningful upgrades that actually really changed the characteristics of the weapons, which didn't really happen this time around. If you look at weapons and the upgrades that are available, they're really kind of what you would expect. Armor piercing, more damage to armor. A scope, which turns into a semi-auto rifle. Faster reloading magazines, which are, you know, magazine expansion, faster reload is on like half of these weapons. Scopes, more ammo. Not really a huge number of upgrades that change the nature of how these weapons work. And as you can see, there really aren't all that many of them. And in terms of the pistol in particular, I can't really see you using that all that often. And ammo for the laser Kraftwerk is fairly annoying to find. I expected far, far more out of a sequel. Bigger, with grander vision, not smaller vision. Improved level design and awesome new locations, rather than smaller, more generic levels that are far more irritating to navigate. Taking another look at some of these systems, you know, for instance, maybe taking another look at perks and saying how they could make them more interesting. It's the same as the first game. And they're just minor upgrades to different things as you do more stuff. Which is fine, you know, passive upgrade systems, they're alright. But they're not exciting, really. You know, it's really hard to get behind them as a truly exciting gameplay and progression mechanic. They're just there. And you generally don't feel the difference. You do when you get these contraption upgrades, certainly. But before that, it's just minor stuff. It's a small game with less ambition than the first one, and what they do have simply wasn't implemented as well. Annoyances piled on other annoyances and focus in all the wrong places. Take what is otherwise a pretty damn good shooter and drag it down constantly. This game has so many damn albatrosses around its neck, it's infuriating, because you can see potential greatness with it. And there is so much that just drove me to frustration throughout the process of beating this campaign. So many things, minor and major, that I just find myself being wholly let down by it, considering how great the New Order was. And Old Blood was not as great, but it was an expand-alone. You know, we didn't necessarily expect it to be incredible. I'm not going to remember a lot of this. I still remember a ton about the New Order, but there's so little memorable here. And I really hoped for a significant advancement on the formula, not steps backwards, which I really do feel it has done in terms of level design, navigation, pacing, and a bloody obsession with non-interactive storytelling. Not what you want for a shooter, you know? Doom didn't have much of a story, but what it did have didn't get in the way of doing what the game did best. This game loves to get in the way of that. God. Bloody disappointing, frankly, in a lot of different ways. Not without its redeeming factors, certainly. And in terms of the core combat loop, not a bad game at all. But the first one had that. And it did the rest of it better. That's not what you want out of a sequel. Certainly not what I was looking for. Wolfenstein 2, the new Colossus, ladies and gentlemen. Available for $60 or your regional equivalent. My name has been TotalBiscuit. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, by all means, do feel free to click the like button. If not, the dislike button is right over there. And I'll see you next time.